Processing Universe. My name's Hank Balch. You're listening to episode 2, Unbroken, Care and Handling of Endoscopes. This particular episode is called Safe Passage, and we're going to be talking about transporting endoscopes to and from the user and how to guard against any damage or risk in that process. We got some great guests in the studio with us today. So young or old, new technician or super experienced, we've got some great insights around transporting scopes for you today. Hang with us. We'll be right back for episode 2. All right, so we're back in studio now for episode 2 of Unbroken, Care and Handling of Endoscopes. And we're going to be talking about safe passage today, transporting these precious cargoes of endoscopes to and from the point of use. And we got some great guests with us today to walk us through what that actually looks like on the front lines. So let's start here with a round of introductions. Maybe, Bobbie, if you'll go first, tell us who you are and what you're doing in the industry today.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Hank. My name is Bobbie Gaskins, and I am the operations manager for Sterile Processing Ambulatory Surgeries with the Cleveland Clinic. Also president of our Northeast Ohio Central Service Association chapter here in Cleveland, Ohio.
Awesome. Welcome to the show today, Bobbie.
Thank you so much.
Let's go next to Nicholas.
Hi there. I'm Nicholas Day. I am a regional manager in the Cleveland, Ohio area at University Hospitals for sterile processing, high-level disinfection, and equipment management. Also, as Bobbie alluded to, I sit on the board for our local HSPA chapter called Northeast Ohio Central Sterile Service Association. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Good to have you, Nick. And we got a repeat guest here with us on episode 2. Garett, what's your story?
Yep. So I'm Garett Kaple, the marketing manager for reprocessing at Richard Wolf. So I handle all of the product management and creative marketing and marketing strategy for the reprocessing products at Richard Wolf. And I had the pleasure of meeting both Nick and Bobbie at the National HSPA Expo out in Las Vegas. So looking forward to talking with them today.
Awesome. Yeah, good to have you back, Garett. I got a feeling we're going to see you in a couple of these episodes. So, we'll see how this shakes out. All right. So let's set the table here. Scope transport, obviously, this is a huge topic in just the general workflow of endoscopes. We've got to get these babies clean. We've got to get them disinfected or sterilized. Well, we got to get them to where they're needed. And then once they're used, we got to get them back to where the reprocessing process starts again. And that, even though that sounds like not a big deal, right? You're just taking it from point A to point B. So many things can happen. And we're going to talk about what those things are here at the beginning. But let's start with guidelines and regulatory. We are one of the most highly regulated parts of the healthcare industry, and these endoscopes are no different. So, Nick, maybe kind of start us off here. And what are those big guidelines or regulations that first come to mind when you dig into this topic of transporting endoscopes?
Awesome. Yeah. So like any device, medical device in the industry, we always first and foremost go to the manufacturer, IFU. So, looking really at the IFU of the device and digesting if they have recommendations on how to properly contain the device within a tray, and then also how to transport it from, point A to point, Z. And, if you can't find something within the IFU that kind of really dictates how to do that appropriately, safely, and effectively, we always go back to our standards such as AAMI or SGNA, depending on the type of scope that you're working with. There's very specific, detailed standards, one being AAMI ST 91 for endoscope processing and transportation. And there is standards being worked on currently that'll be coming out down the line, regarding transportation of, medical devices internally and externally. So I look forward to seeing more come out about these standards.
So, Nick, you brought up the topic of IFUs. It took us maybe 2 or 3 minutes into the episode to bring up IFUs, so no surprise there. Can you give me a couple of examples, right? So, that's a great place to start, right? So it's, hey, we've got IFUs for these devices. And that should be the first place that we look to see, do they say anything about transport? But what would, what are some examples of maybe some aspects of transportation or, modes of transportation or whatnot that would be commonly found in an IFU, if it's referencing anything at all about transporting this device?
Yeah, so recommendations I've seen in IFUs have been from anything from, what type of container to use to what type of placeholders to contain the scope in it properly. So like as it's being moved from places that it's stable and not shaking, rattling, loose, and, jarring around in there to where you can damage or break the scope. And then anything from, like I said, the type of container that the manufacturer may be recommending to the type of placeholders within the tray. And then also what to put in the tray with that type of scope, be it flexible or rigid, if you're allowed to have accessories, if you're allowed to have other instrumentation. A lot of people you'll see will bundle some rigid scopes within a set, like whether it be a urology set or a camera set with like an arthroscope and a C-mount camera, a coupler and a light cord. And those are all things you got to take into consideration, how you lay those trays out and what the manufacturer recommends from that IFU perspective.
So, Bobbie, when we're talking about these guidelines, recommendations that Nick kind of laid out there, it's one thing for the reprocessing team to know about these guidelines and recommendations, but there's another team on the other side of the coin, and it's the user. How common is it for users of these endoscopes to be aware of the kinds of guidelines or recommendations that Nick was just talking about? And if it's not common, where have you seen the gaps? What are the documents or the guidelines maybe that they're not as familiar with that's important to get in front of them if we're going to be having this conversation about how to properly transport?
I think majority of the time it can be a foreign language to them. And it's important to have that interdisciplinary team that gets everyone together and does the education. Here at the Cleveland Clinic, there are family health centers that handle the scopes actually get competencied now. It wasn't always that way. We've came a very long way from scopes being bundled in with instrumentation to now being segregated, isolated, and handled with care. Even at one of my facilities, the gaps that we would see is exactly what I mentioned. We had actually a flexible cystoscope come down to us in an amber transport bin, and there's stainless steel stringer instrumentation, scissors, hemostats pressed up against that distal tip. And it took me, documenting, going to that team, educating, coming in and speaking with them and having that relationship as well to help them understand the importance. The why behind what we do is so important, not only to our caregivers when we're telling them how to clean and reprocess, but the physicians, the clinicians, the nurses that are handling them daily as well. So for me, that interdisciplinary team and communication and a relationship is the first phase.
Yeah. So that phrase interdisciplinary, I'm going to bring that over to Garett here because, we're talking to clinicians who are talking about, hey, there's multiple teams involved in all this, but obviously there's a manufacturer that's involved in every device. Someone has made this thing. And to Nick's point, there's IFUs then that are matched up with this device that are helping to communicate that. Why do manufacturers or why should manufacturers care about this stage and this phase of transporting the device in the way that we're talking about today?
So yeah, with IFUs, really there isn't much with transport, right? So it's all about, I guess, how they can train their employees. But on our side, we like to provide products that can help keep the device safe and also make it easy for them to transport the device. Because sometimes these devices are going right down the hall, or other times they got to go down 8 floors and through wherever, So I think it's our job to keep IFUs up to date, though. I get a lot of calls from customers asking, hey, what does this mean in IFU? So I think it's important to understand IFUs, obviously, and then help customers interpret them. And but when it comes to transport, I think just having the right products and coming out with products that can help with transport are the main focus.
Yeah, that seems like common sense, right? Hey, they're going to have to move this scope from point A to point B. But it's so easy to get missed, not just for scopes, for a lot of these medical devices that are manufactured. And as they become more and more complex, the challenges around transporting them safely become more complex. And we've been dancing around this issue a little bit, Bobbie, but I want to come back to you here on just a basic question on, hey, what are the risks if we get this wrong? What can happen to these devices if we're unaware of the regulatory expectations out there, or if we are aware, but we're just not compliant with them?
So the first thing that came to my mind is patient harm. That is the number one highest risk that improper handling and care can cause. If the scope is damaged and broken, we may not always find it the first time around. And then bacteria can harbor, biofilm can form, and then it's used on that second patient, and you have an HAI that they're leaving this hospital with that they didn't come in. And so that's the top risk that we see in our field. It's life and death. We have extremely high risk patients coming in, and we don't want them getting an infection from a device that's supposed to be saving their lives. And it might be their one and only procedure they've ever had. And it's simply putting the device back in its container. And if you're not policing and educating and ensuring it's being done, sooner or later they end up throwing it right there in the case cart, and it's laying on the bottom of the case cart or intermingled with the tray, and you don't always see the damage the first time around. It's important that each time we handle it, it's the same and you have that process and routine.
I'm glad you started there with the patient. Obviously, Bobbie, that is number one in everything that we do on the reprocessing side of things. And Nick, even though, patient harm, obviously that's the top priority to reduce and to guard against, but there's other threats and risks in properly transporting endoscopes. What else would you put on that list as maybe a number 2 or number 3?
I can give you a couple. So yeah, like number 2, number 3 would probably be just not having the inventory to do the amount of cases that you're normally doing. Adding to that capital expenditure for, repair or replacement of these types of scopes. When you get into these flexible scopes, are, very high dollar repair, high dollar replacements, upwards of $15,000, $20,000, $30,000, depending on the type of scope. Rigid scopes are becoming increasingly more expensive to repair and replace, given the, advances in technology. The third thing, being the non-compliant risk of staff, whether it be the OR or SPD, and not adhering to the process, violating policy. We risk potentially, corrective action and losing, employees. And you have that in that retention and staffing struggle to keep people on board. So you got to get this under control. It's something you just have to work on from a collaborative effort with your operating room and CSP.
Yeah, Nick, as you were describing what happens when a scope goes out for service or out for repair, I should say, I had a little bit of PTSD through my mind of the feeling when you walk in and they're like, yeah, the second scope has gone down or the third scope has gone down the inventory, just the ripple effects that has across the team and across service. Can you, for anyone who has not gone through that, firsthand, or maybe they just don't have the volume that would impact clinical delivery in that way, but can you walk through what actually happens and what that feeling is, maybe from the leadership perspective or even the reprocessing technician perspective, when some of these scopes end up going down and the delay in repair or replacement that you alluded to?
Yeah, start with identifying, whether it be a scope that comes down tagged from the operating room that may have been dropped by a member of the staff in the procedure, and they marked it as this needs repair, a broken lens or something, but they don't disclose that it was dropped by the surgeon.
Or it was banged around in the case card on the way down, right? Like what Bobbie said, right?
The transport. It could be not put back into the tray appropriately or within a red bin contained by itself or whatever it may be. They opened the door and the scope was just sitting on the shelf of the case cart and a bunch of other stuff, and it trickled out and fell on the floor and broke. The techs get those and decon, and they see that note. So that's where it really starts the process, because if it's not documented, as broken, or our techs don't do a good investigation or evaluation on the scope and decon, then that's going to get clean, pushed through, and hopefully during another inspection and assembly that it gets identified that there's an issue with the scope. So the whole process is very lengthy just before it even gets to the leadership end, if it's identified. And then, we have to get the scope, identify, who to contact and notify, whether it be under a service agreement or if it's an a la carte repair, replace, then we reach out to our vendor and initiate that process. We generally have to place an order, a PO, to start the process to get it repaired. And then we're at liberty of those back order situations on a lot of devices nowadays where you may be waiting, upwards 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plus days to get a replacement scope in. So generally, most of these sets that these scopes are in, whether it be a flexible or semi-rigid or rigid, they cannot go up missing the scope because that's a critical item for the procedure. So those sets also, then the tech has to, go through that, and they identify that they don't have the scopes for that specific set. So the tray has to be put up on a missing shelf down for an item needing replacement. Once we get the scope back in, you have to, go through the process of, checking it in, inspecting that the replacement scope is good, because I've gotten scopes in that have been subpar as a repair replacement myself, without naming any vendors, and we've had to go back and, address that. And then you have another wait to get a replacement for that scope that was a replacement. So that whole process takes time and takes away from your availability of your inventory.
And there's frustration, like you alluded to the cost, but there's frustration on the part of the technician. There's frustration on the part of the user, the clinician. If you're a patient that's impacted, like, you're delayed maybe in your case, or, God forbid, maybe your case is canceled because they don't have the scope that they need to do that procedure. So there's just a tremendous waterfall, as you alluded to, Nick. And I know we have talked about some of these already, Bobbie, but there are specific things to maybe use the opposite of best practices. There are specific worst practices when it comes to transporting scopes. Could you just lay out, a very simple list for anyone who has maybe seen some of these, but not all of these, that you would say these are the higher risk activities that could lead to exactly what Nick was talking about, this huge ripple effect out if a scope becomes damaged?
I've worked my way up all the way from certified tech to this position now. And I remember being a tech, and you get that case cart and you open it up, and the rigid scopes are mixed in with the stainless steel instrumentation, or they're thrown into a stainless steel basin and they're laying on the bottom. Anytime you're not putting the scope segregated by itself, you're going to have a risk for damage. So that's number one, in my opinion, is if it's not put back into its transport container. Number two would be when it's inside that stainless steel basket mess with instrumentation. You just really want to make sure it's segregated in a way.
So, Garett, when you're hearing from customers out there in this space, and, they may be reaching out for you for any number of reasons, but you start asking questions and you realize, there's a transport challenge here at this facility. What are some themes or commonalities that end up coming up when you end up helping these kinds of facilities work through this? Is there anything in that kind of sticks out as an obstacle that makes it more difficult for some facilities rather than others to get this right?
The main thing that comes to mind is probably some of the customers not necessarily knowing which scope might go in which tray. Sometimes we've seen flexible instruments that are in a tray for flexible, but maybe not necessarily that particular flexible instrument. And if Bobbie's talked about the distal tip a couple of times, if that's not secured properly, that's the most fragile part of your scope. And that can, a lot of times we've seen lids get placed on because the tip's not secured right, or it's just in an open container and getting bounced around during transport. So those are some of the more common things. And when myself or our clinical team goes in to do in-services, those are some of the things we try to help out with and just make sure they're using the right tools for the right equipment, I guess, per se.
Yeah. That distal tip, as you said, is great. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
to your point, Garrett, I've seen a distal tip of a scope closed in a case cart door. It comes down and you see the tip pointing out at the door and you're like, well, here we go. And that one's, it's not going to be good. It's leaking.
Yeah. So, if anyone's tuning into this episode, you're thinking, oh man, this is all doom and gloom, right? Like our scopes are just destined to be treated poorly and to be damaged. Well, there's hope. We're going to end on a high note here. We're going to talk about what that hope looks like. Way back in 2013, 2014, we had a scope care and handling project we called Hope for Scopes. Not too creative, but it was trying to get at this idea that there is hope. We can fix the process no matter how broken it is and how much it's costing us and how many frustrations and whatnot. And so, Bobbie, before we started this interview, you told me very confidently that we have seen success in this area. So I want to start with you and say, how did you address this? And what was the impact to your inventory, to your staff, to your efficiency, et cetera?
Yeah, so I've been manager of the ambulatory surgery centers for about 2 years now. And I not only have my SPD and my ORs, but I have family health centers that are attached to us. So we have urology family health centers, ENT family health centers, which are both using flexible and rigid scopes. And when I first came in, it was those bins with stainless steel instruments and the scope intermingled and all this damage, minimal inventory in these ambulatory surgery centers as well. And when they went down, you have a physician with their hair on fire and a real big problem to solve. And so that was one of my first big initiatives, was getting the scope repair and damage under control in my family health centers. And what I did was I met with my leadership team in SPD originally and sat down with them and game planned. What are we seeing? Where do we want to go? And what we were seeing was damage, mishandling, and the finger being pointed at us saying, you're the problem. And where we wanted to go was really building a relationship and having an understanding of the why behind what we're doing. So we started that plight, looped in education, looped in the family health center directors. I have 5 different locations, so I had to get all of those FHC directors in a meeting together to lay out the standards, bring in the AAMI standard, bring in the IFU, partner with the SPD education and perioperative education to really go, we want to support you, and here's the facts and the why behind it. What do you need from us? Because they had challenges as well. One, minimal inventory with no support, and the nursing directors not really understanding the frontline need. It was just this turnover and we were making it happen. So we were living in a state of chaos. So we, peeled back that onion for the leadership team to go, you need more inventory. 2, laid out those standards, which one of those standards is we want to decontaminate scopes within an hour of pre-clean. And they were not documenting time of pre-clean on flex scopes specifically. So we partnered with a rep and got them tags for them to start tagging the pre-clean time. Then we looked at transportation as a whole as well. In the ambulatory setting, we have facilities that have 1 washer, 1 sink, and minimal staff. So getting large red bins for 1 small scope was a real bottleneck for us. So we condensed the size of containers that we used for rigid scopes that were being segregated and kept by themselves. And then we transitioned to smaller containers as well for the cystoscopes and the flexible ENT scopes to make it easier to get those bins through, which then gave us more time to focus on inspection and the details versus cleaning a red bin. And really the final piece of that is keeping that open line of communication and also closing the loop when there are issues. It wasn't, okay, here's the tools, here's the resources, do it. It was my leadership team, me physically going and checking in. Are you guys doing okay? How's the bins working out? How is the documentation of pre-clean? And are you happy with the process? Making sure they had what they needed as our customer as well. And now we have an open line of communication to where they know if they send us a scope without that pre-clean ticket, that they're getting a call from my lead tech to resolve it right then and there. And we also have introduced disposable scopes for those moments of we don't have what you need because we have, one sterilizer and we have to focus on the OR right now. Because in ambulatory, when you don't have a large resource of equipment and inventory, we do have to make sure we have backup and contingency. So we implemented disposable scopes, and we've really 360'd from a broken scope every day, physician's hair on fire, to now it's cool, calm, and collected, and we all talk and get along.
I think that's what every clinician wants, is to be cool, calm, and collected.
Yes. Every
day when they clock in. And, Bobbie brought up the idea of peeling back that onion, Nick, as a way to say, well, let's make sure everyone's aware of the scope of, use a pun there, the scope of the challenge before we start fixing it, right? Because you don't want to fix something if not everyone's quite aware of what's really broken and what the implications are, et cetera. But then, she closed on this idea of auditing the process. So all the changes were made, but now she's keeping that line of communication open to say, yeah, but is this sustainable? Are we keeping the change that we work so hard to see? I'm assuming some similar things are going to come up in your success story. Walk us through what you've seen out there in, taking the doom and gloom to the calm, cool, and collected, like Bobbie said.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Bobbie alluded to a lot there. So, a lot of my stories are pretty similar, but what we kind of did is, when I came into my role and in my current role, there was some pretty, or I'll restate it, some processes that needed improvement. And so collaboration with the operating room was, going to be our number one priority, really just bringing pictures and data cost of replacements of these types of scopes to their knowledge. And, whether it be going up at 7 a.m. and performing a morning huddle where you present a 6 to 10 page PowerPoint to the operating room and show them the pictures of improper table breakdown and scope damage, and kind of allude to the capital expenditure of how much we've spent over this amount of time. And then really from there, working with them to learn what a good process would look like for, ensuring that it's most efficient for them to set up the case. So you have, you're adhering to your on-time starts of, getting the stuff out of a set that may be built safely, but then also efficiently putting the stuff back in there to protect it on the way back to decon. So we collaborated with the operating room to really build out our table breakdown and transportation process, more so on the decon end, but we did partner with them on how trays are set up and making sure that they're protected in the best manner. And we kind of standardized that. We made a workflow, laminated it, and that is up in the operating room. It's down in our decon. And then, as Bobbie alluded to, we kind of have that open line of communication to where we're placing real-time qualities on both ends. If they get a scope that wasn't set up correctly the way it's supposed to be, and it could have caused damage on CSP's end, but also on our end in decon, if we identify like they just threw it in the case cart, not back in the tray to protect it, we're putting a quality in and following up with those and doing education. Same thing with our offsite reprocessing. We do a lot of flexible ENT and urology scopes, and we set up with those suites, physician offices, how to best protect those scopes within those trays through the transportation offsite process, and really developed kind of a standardized layout of the tray, the scope, and really followed through on just that real-time feedback auditing on how well it's going, and checked and trended our damage control.
Yeah, that transparency piece, I don't know if you use that phrase or not, but the photos and the communication on, what does a good setup look like, to your point, and then continuing to audit the process with more transparency. It goes both ways. It's not just how did we receive the scope at decon, as you said, but also how did the customer receive the scope at the point of use. And I think that is a very balanced and again, to use the word sustainable approach to change, because it keeps trust on both sides of the coin there. And None of the change that we've talked about, here today would be possible without that mutual trust that's earned, like Bobbie said, with FaceTime, getting out there in the trenches to really talk to and expose the scope of the challenges. But then also, Nick, to your point, the trust that goes into, hey, we're going to audit this process transparently because it's for the good of both of us and the patient. So we're going to wrap. I know we just scratched the surface here for the challenges, the guidelines, and even the best practices and success stories that are out there. I'm sure you'll have many other stories to tell along those lines. But the good news is all three of our guests today are on LinkedIn, so you can track him down and look him up and connect with them. And I'm sure they'd volunteer their time to respond to any other questions that you may have or any other insights you want to share with them about what you've seen work on this endoscope transport question. I want to thank you all for tuning in to this episode 2 of this series. We're not done yet. We got more to come in this series. So if you've enjoyed the show so far, make sure to tune in for the next episode of Unbroken. And I want to thank our guests today for sharing your insight and your time with us. Thank you, Bobbie and Nicholas and Garett.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's going to do it for episode 2 of this Unbroken Care and Handling of Endoscopes series, sponsored by Richard Wolf Medical Instruments Corporation. And hopefully you enjoyed that conversation around transportation challenges for these endoscopes. We're going to pick up that theme again a little bit in episode 3 as we talk about challenges specific to the decontamination area of this workflow. So if you're thinking, they can get broken other places, well, you're right, and we're going to dive right into that as we continue this Unbroken series. If you're not already subscribed to the Beyond Clean channels to catch these future episodes, now's your friendly reminder to do so. And as we mentioned in the show, make sure to connect with any of the guests that you have further questions for. And until we talk to you again, like we tell you all the time here at Beyond Clean, keep fighting dirty.